Carole Walker on Times Radio.
Now, Ford is set to cut 1,300 jobs, about 20% of its UK workforce, in a significant blow to Britain's car industry. The move is part of a wider cut of jobs across its European business, where a total of around 3,800 jobs are being cut, with 2,300 due to go in Germany. Earlier, I spoke to Quentin Willson, former Top Gear host and transport campaigner, and Jim Holder, editorial director at Autocar. And Jim started by explaining why Ford are cutting so many jobs in the UK.
Well, they've cited the cost of living crisis, inflation, the war in Ukraine, the various societal problems that are impacting us at the moment. But I think probably you have to look more long term. They have pledged to invest $50 billion into their plans to electrify their entire range of cars by the end of the decade. And obviously they need to both pay for it and to ensure that they're competitive in selling those vehicles, and the prices they sell them for are competitive. And it is a fact that electric vehicles have fewer mechanical parts. They are less complex in many ways to develop, and that their competitors who are purely building electric cars are able to do so with less employees and particularly less R&D employees. And that's where this has really impacted, taking out around 1/5 of its European workforce.
Just before I bring in Quentin, haven't they already been able to produce cars with fewer staff because of the automation of the production lines?
It's certainly true that all car manufacturers are always looking to save at every last bit of cost that they can. They famously work to very small margins despite the big figures that the industry uses and operates to. So there is an increasing amount of automation, and we only have to look at the wider world and other industries to see that a greater degree of automation is on the way. And absolutely, they will want to take advantage of every step there. But you have to also say there are opportunities, and there are opportunities in this new technology, and particularly around electrification, for new skills and new labour that can be brought into the industry and which can improve the industry. So you have to look at it from both ways as well.
Quentin, do you think it was inevitable that companies like Ford, as they move towards electric vehicles, are going to just shed jobs?
It's easy to craft a narrative that says that electrification will cost us industrial jobs. And I think the Telegraph ran with a headline today, net zero costs Ford 1,300 jobs. But there is an inevitability to this. And all car manufacturers are going through a difficult time at the moment, particularly in Europe. And we heard, last week that Nissan was having to cut its costs significantly to be able to remain in Sunderland. So there's a wider malaise here of declining sales numbers, historic declining sales numbers, and rising costs with particularly energy, which has affected inflation and interest rates. So it's not that simple to say that. Yes, Jim's right. I think the lack of combustion components in cars is going to make them easier to make with bigger profit margins. If you look at Tesla, the margins on their cars are epic, which is why they've been able to reduce prices recently. But it is, we're looking at a declining European motor industry, but particularly in the UK. And I think there's a wider point here about the industrial strategy, which the government just doesn't have. And if it carries on neglecting the motor industry like it has, we will see them all disappear. Jim makes this really good point about opportunities too. I mean, just today, Ford have announced a $3.5 billion factory in America to build batteries and F-150 Lightnings. But you've got this huge pull from America from the Inflation Reduction Act, $480 billion for green tech. And that's going to really, really affect us. And the EU are going to be doing the same thing with similar amounts of incentives. So it's a kind of global race to attract investment into countries for this green technology.
And we should just explain that Inflation Reduction Act in the United States effectively is a legislation which provides incentives for companies that produce stuff like electric cars in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And consumers get incentives as well, $7,500 off the price of their electric cars. But here in the UK, we've even stopped giving people £500 for electric chargers. So we really do need to think very, very long and hard about how we keep our motor industry here and how we take the opportunities that electrification gives us and use them.
Jim, do you think that there is an important role for the government here to be doing more to support businesses, in particular, as they make this transition to electric vehicles?
Yeah, I'd say it's more than important. I'd say it's absolutely critical. They've set out a goal of ending the sale of new combustion engined cars from 2030 and 2035 without hybrid power, but they haven't really set out a path on how to get there, and they haven't created the environment that allows us to thrive once we have got there. This is an industry that employs nigh on 1 million people in the UK. It's incredibly valuable to the country, yet we see it floundering, and we see it floundering for a variety of reasons, but most of them link back to the lack of a long-term plan to give us an electric car industry that can thrive. And the point Quentin makes about the battery facility is particularly critical. Part of the deal with Brexit was that, in effect, we would have to manufacture our own batteries in the UK for use in the cars that we manufacture here, or we will face huge tariffs on the vehicles that we export. And that's a fact now. But what have we done to stimulate the building of these gigafactories, these battery factories? Next to nothing. There's very little capacity. Europe's running ahead with it. China is probably a decade ahead. America has put tens of billions, hundreds of billions into stimulating the market. And we're sat here looking at each other, wondering what to do next. So I would say it's more than critical, even that the government gets on and produces a long-term strategy.
And Jim, we just saw recently, didn't we, the plans for a battery factory in the northeast collapsed.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was a factory that had a lot of potential and would have kick-started, hopefully, a lot more manufacturing. It was perhaps only going to supply a small percentage of what we really need to even keep our industry at the level it is today. But it did collapse, and it collapsed for a variety of reasons. But all of them fundamentally underline the point that unless these factories do get invested in quickly, because they aren't built quickly and they cost an absolute fortune and take a long time to become operational, we are going to be left behind. We're going to introduce this new regulation that enforces the manufacturing of new electric vehicles, but not with any capacity in our country to actually achieve that.
Quentin, a moment ago, you said that if we carry on as we are, there is a danger that the car industry in the UK will disappear completely. Do you think it really is as serious as that?
Yes, it is. And I mean, Jim makes the point about the tariffs. Now, we've got the Brexit situation where we have to make, this is called rules of origin, we have to make a proportion of our electric cars here in the UK. And if we don't, then we have to pay a tax on them when we export them, which is going to make them uncompetitive. So it's really important that we can do that, and not having a battery factory of any significance here is going to really put pressure on people like JLR, people like McLaren, Lotus, Mini's already gone to China. This is going to make it very difficult for manufacturers in the UK with electric cars to be competitive here.
Yeah, because Quentin, I'm just looking at some of the recent casualties. BMW has switched its future production from Cowley to China, as you mentioned. Jaguar closing its assembly lines at Castle Bromwich. We've had the closure of the Honda plant at Swindon, an end to the manufacture of the Vauxhall Astra at Ellesmere Port. And we haven't been hearing about the opening of new electric production lines to compensate, have we?
No, I mean, and you look at JLR. I mean, they've got a battery factory, battery production over in Slovakia, and they're going to bring out 3 new Jaguar electrified models. So why would they do it here? You know, it's going to cost them more. They're going to have to make those batteries and the battery packs over in Europe, because otherwise they will be taxed heavily on sales. So there's a kind of awful inevitability to this if you don't do something about it. And it's probably too late now. If they'd managed to get Britishvolt working properly, you know, you would have a factory maybe in a couple of years. But that means they've lost 2 years starting from scratch. It's not looking good.
Jim, is there a wider problem that the government's transport strategy, such as it is about encouraging us to get out of our cars and to use the trains, to cycle more, use other forms of public transport and so on, rather than accepting that for some people the car is still essential?
I think the two can coexist, in all honesty, if the will was there. I think what you have to understand or appreciate is that a huge amount of global wealth has been generated by the freedom of movement afforded by the car and the general ability to have easy access to mobility, again, afforded by the car. Now, that's not to say that we don't want to get more people out of cars and onto other forms of transport. And it's not to say that we shouldn't be pushing for that. But history kind of proves that it's not necessarily what people want, and it's not necessarily always the most effective way to move people around. So it feels like the two need to coexist. And absolutely, that's where other countries are going. That's what other strategies are providing. I think you used a phrase such as it is, and I think that's what's critical here. The government has been very busy doing other things for some time now, and without any kind of strategy behind this, without any long-term goal, without knitting together the various pieces that need to come together to make this work. The electric car revolution can only be good for the planet if it ties in the power infrastructure, the use of renewable energy, the concept of vehicle to grids and cars being part of the grid, using their batteries to actually power the grid. All of these things need pulling together from the top with a proper industrial strategy, and it just isn't happening.
And Quentin, are you concerned that the current Conservative government will view any kind of system of incentives, such as that Inflation Reduction Act that we were talking about in the US, as not fundamentally the sort of thing that a Conservative government should be doing to prop up an industry? Or do you think that there is scope for something like that to happen, even at this late stage, to rescue the car industry?
If we had the money, then yeah, sure. I'd say we need to do this. We need to be competitive, but we don't. But the mixed messages that come from the government, in the sense that with public charging, you're charged 20% VAT, whereas charging your electric car at home, domestic, it's 5%. The HMRC rate for using electric car is about 8p compared to considerably more for a combustion car. They put the road tax, or they will be putting the VED, vehicle excise duty, up on electric cars by 2025 to nearly £500. So kind of similar to a diesel SUV. So all these mixed messages coming out of government show that they really don't understand how to incentivize this market and make it work. It's almost acts of self-sabotage. So they don't drive electric cars as a community of people, legislators and politicians and MPs, so they don't really get it. And that's the problem. They're making all these rhetorical noises about it being so good. And as Jim says, there are huge social and economic benefits from this electric revolution. But the government, the legislators, the parliamentarians need to understand what levers they've got to pull to make this 2030 deadline viable, because if they don't, it won't be viable, and it'll have to be shifted, and then it'll be a real, embarrassment for them. So, if I thought they knew what they were doing, I'd be delighted, but I'm afraid I don't think they do.
Well, that was Quentin Willson, former Top Gear host and transport campaigner, and Jim Holder, editorial director at Autocar, speaking to me just a little earlier this evening here on Times Radio.
Chloe Tilley and Callum